Following the sacking of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth and his tribe in the year 410, the sands of time and a veil of legends fell over Rome, that former great intellectual, political and artistic capital of the ancient world. Many fled to the safety of the hills, and the city fell into decay, never to recover its former glory, although it didn't disappear entirely during the Middle Ages. Despite being exhausted by wars, famines and epidemics, gradually its people came back to the old capital, taking refuge along the Tiber River, populating its centre, which remained surrounded by vast, abandoned spaces for centuries. From the 11th century onward, temples, baths and theatres in disrepair were used as quarries for marble, an invaluable building material. A lime kiln was also set up between the Capitoline Hill and Tiber River to reduce great slabs of ancient limestone to lime for use in the mortar to build new buildings. To celebrate the year 1300, 2 million pilgrims descended on Rome because it was rumoured anyone who visited St. Peter's would receive absolution for their sins from the Pope. A guide written for travellers, the Mirabilia Urbis Romae, or the Marvels of Rome, was so successful it was republished for centuries. Its contents, however, reflected a very real decline in the knowledge and understanding of the city as it had been. Nature became the embodiment of truth, and notable humanists such as the poets Dante Alighieri, 1265 to 1321, who wrote the Divine Comedy, Francesco Petrarca or Petrarch, 1304 to 1374, who wrote the epic poem Africa, and Giovanni Boccaccio, 1313 to 1375, whose greatest work, the Decameron, was very influential. The three were given the title the Three Crowns of Florence, and their views on such topics as economics, politics, the visual arts, science, music, philosophy, theology and women had far-reaching implications beyond their own culture. Wealthy Italian nobles turned their fortified castles into pleasure palaces, laying out new ornamental gardens and collecting plants. Boccaccio emphasised plant collecting in the Decameron. He said, "It would take long to tell how many plants there were, and of what sorts and how they were arranged, but there was an abundance of every pleasant plant which grows in our climate." Petrarch is believed by many scholars to be the founder of the classical Renaissance. As a poet, his fame lasted for over 5 centuries, and his works included a great variety of Italian sonnets, madrigals and songs. These were mostly inspired by his unrequited passion for Laura, believed to be Laura de Nove, who married Hugo de Sade in 1325 and had 11 children. In 1348, when she died, Petrarch was consumed by a passion that became known for its constancy and purity. Dante Alighieri's reputation is based on his Commedia, a poem of more than 14,000 lines whose symbolism is complex. Written in Vulgare, the language of the common people, it reveals God gradually to the pilgrim on a personal journey through Inferno, Purgatorio and Paradiso. Condemned because of political affiliations to perpetual exile from Florence, with the prospect of being burned at the stake if he returned, Dante from 1301 spent his life roaming Italy until Prince Guido Novello di Polenta invited him to live at Ravenna in 1318, where he finished his Paradiso. He then died aged 56 in 1321, and it's interesting to note that the city of Florence officially repealed his sentence in 2008. The Three Crowns of Florence, Francesco Petrarch, Dante Alighieri and Giovanni Boccaccio reached back into antiquity for their literary sources. Their work would impact on the world in which they lived, at every level of society, both political and personal. It would also inspire the emergence of a native star, helping shape the character of a newly emerging Italian culture, one that would include the painter and poet as active participants in the government of the polis. The medieval church had taught that all things should be examined in regard to moral values, considering the entire universe exclusively in relation to the church. This minimized people's works and aspirations, and in their imagination, uncultivated areas of the countryside, including forests, were populated with malignant spirits. And for a long time, this was a fear that outlaws and other law-breaking citizens were able to capitalize on. However, by the 15th century, there was a very real need for exceptional change. Many men and women had begun questioning the world around them and their place in it, and this new period of scientific examination would bring about a period of creative frenzy, which infected not only artists, architects and scholars, but also the rich, and by the now very educated rulers of many of the city-states that made up the landmass we now know as Italy. New ideas associated with the pagan pursuit of happiness were in the ascendancy, and the strong social contact people had with each other created a dawning of consciousness and an exploration of the relationship of the individual to the natural world. This period has since become known as the Renaissance, or the rebirth of humanism, a rejection of religion in favour of a belief in the advancement of humanity by its own efforts. From humanist writings grew the sense that not the afterlife, but also the life here and now, was a proper concern of humanity. As a consequence, the way religion was interpreted was held up for close examination, as humankind embraced a capitalist economy that would transform artistic life in Italy as it had in Athens 2,000 years previously. All over Europe, literacy and learning for the nobleman and his family became increasingly important, as would a perception of loyalty to family, ancient house, estates, and the security of an established lineage. Feudal society was being replaced by a modern corporate system, with social dynamism disrupting traditional systems of privilege by rank. The new humanist way of thinking promoted the idea that if man had faith in himself, he would recognize the true value of history, would learn to honor men of the past, and, in turn, learn to honor himself. Reputation, fame, and secular glory were his ideal goal. By increasing the prestige of his ancestry and lineage, he knew that his will would survive through his sons and the sons of his sons. This placed an enormous amount of importance on the birth of an heir, which, like all such ideological constructs, are often taken to extreme. This change in attitude climaxed first in Italy during the 15th and 16th centuries, when many of the beliefs and values Western civilization still treasures the most today were reaffirmed. They are the effectiveness of personal freedom and liberty, the generous toleration of all other religions, pride in self and family, with art in all its forms providing a vehicle for self-discovery. Italian artist and architect Raphael Sanzio di Urbino, 1483 to 1520, known as Raphael, painted a fresco known as the School of Athens. In this controversial work, he depicts the pagan and Christian worlds facing each other as equals. The pagan world is presented as a gathering of the greatest minds of antiquity and contains portraits of many of the contemporary giants of the Renaissance period. In the centre, Greek philosopher Plato, which is really the artist Leonardo da Vinci in disguise, points upward while his pupil, philosopher, scientist and tutor of Alexander the Great, Aristotle, points down to the earth. On the lower right, expounding a geometrical proof with compasses, is the Greek mathematician Euclid, which is really the architect Donato Bramante in disguise. Greek philosopher and moralist Diogenes is on the steps, alongside the Greek philosopher on nature, Heraclitus, played by Michelangelo, who is resting his chin to write on a block of stone. Philosopher, sage and mathematician Pythagoras is sitting surrounded by his disciples in the left foreground. The Christian world is shown diagrammatically, divided horizontally into two levels. The link between them, the Eucharist or celebration of the body and blood of Christ, exists at a human level, as the host on the altar and the divine, that is the body of Christ, is descending vertically through the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Sandro Botticelli's painting of Venus, the goddess of beauty, is breathtaking. She represents the real world with a clarity that totally transcends the study of proportion, perspective, and anatomy. Her image is at the very heart of the foundation of Renaissance art in all its forms. Venus stood for sexual love, ruling the season of spring, presiding over nature's fecundity. Her many love affairs gave her a particular appeal to the humanist courts of Italy, and she shared the hostile overtones of the Middle Ages, which associated her only with sinful lust, and she spread her happiness before her. In 1414, while accompanying the Pope on a visit to a Benedictine monastery, historian Poggio Bracciolini discovered a handbook about the ancient Roman system of education called The Training of an Orator. This, as well as later finds, inspired scholars whose passion for exploration was directed towards searching monasteries for manuscripts and then copying and translating the texts. Some Roman authors rediscovered were Ovid, Livy, and Lucretius, and ultimately Pope Nicholas V, 1447 to 1455, never went anywhere at all without a tribe of scribes, and he ordered his agents to acquire Greek manuscripts regardless of cost. In 1430, Poggio surveyed the ruins of Rome and recorded that the public and private edifices that were founded for eternity lie prostrate, naked and broken, like the limbs of a mighty giant. And the ruin is the more visible from the stupendous relics that have survived the injuries of time and fortune. At St. Gall in the same year, Poggio also made another important discovery, an ancient architectural manuscript written in the 1st century by the Roman engineer and architect Marcus Pollio Vitruvius. This work discussed all types of Greek and Roman building, civic and domestic, architecture, town planning, water supplies, civil engineering, geometry and astronomy, including methods of decoration in stucco and fresco. Vitruvius's manuscript became known to 15th century architects from the edition published in 1486. His voice spoke across 14 centuries when he declared, "A man's body is a model of proportion because with arms or legs extended, it fits into those perfect geometrical forms, the square and the circle." Proportion, whether in the human body or in a sacred building, came to be considered the distinctive mark of beauty and a reflection of God's cosmic order. The circumference of the circle is the same as the perimeter of a square, so when sparing the circle, the human body is at the place where the synthesis of earth and heaven occur. Scholars also discovered the ancient Roman achievement was not a sudden creation, but owed a heavy debt to ancient Greece and Athenian democracy. From then on, the classical ideal became a subject of intense pursuit. During the 14th century, a citizen had been reticent about displaying his wealth in a dangerous and uncertain world. However, by the Quattrocento or 15th century, the demonstration of wealth became the key to social and political dominance. Communities gained new wealth. However, the inequalities between people in different walks of life grew more pronounced. The primary mission of every individual was to acquire, defend, or increase his or her social role within the limits of the community's toleration, while seeking to win the approval or incite the envy of others. Scholars studying ancient texts discovered the ideal garden of antiquity had been a union of architecture and horticulture. Gone was the separate entity, or the garden from medieval times that existed visually unrelated to its adjoining house, villa, or castle. The unity of structural elements would become the great Renaissance contribution to the art of garden design. Vitruvius had devoted an entire chapter in his 10 books on architecture to the water organ, which he considered carefully and exquisitely contrived in all respects. It provided a mystical experience, and automated figures and fountains revolving and spraying to the sounds of music never failed to astonish visitors. At the Villa d'Este at Tivoli, people thrilled to the aquatic soundscape provided by designer Piero Leggiorio and engineer Orazio Oliveri. During the 15th century, Rome was dirty, depopulated, and in ruins. One contemporary description compared it to an old woman dressed in rags. There was really no scientific excavation at all. To put it into historical perspective, when Christopher Columbus was busy exploring the New World, back at Rome, artists, scholars, princes, adventurers, and popes all began feverishly searching through the soil for remains of its former splendour. Rome was being plundered and brought back to life in descriptions, maps and plans, and actually rebuilt, all at the same time. From the 14th to the 16th century, there was a very little interest in Rome's urban fabric. Most maps being produced were little more than compendiums of monuments, and the idealized images of antiquity were a far cry from contemporary descriptions by the Roman poet Horace of a smoky, rich, noisy Rome. Archaeology was not yet a science, and topographers of the 15th century regarded ancient literature as more important than any other source. Increased architectural activity created a great interest in the theory of building design and the way in which comfort and convenience might best be achieved, and interior design and furnishing became a subject for written theory. Many cities throughout Italy underwent substantial urban renewal, setting a pattern for the future. Illustrations from paintings and Italian fresco cycles are the only visual references we have of the style of interiors preferred during the 15th and 16th centuries. If these are related to written inventories of the period, we can try and envisage how our ancestors lived. At any period, what we do not really understand, however, is just what they took for granted, as this was not recorded. The fresco became the first and most powerful tool in decorative painting indoors. Newly executed fresco painting in oils could be quite brilliant in their effect, and the colours astonishing. Frescoes were used often in the sala or principal room, one in which guests were received and banqueting took place. Alfresco from 1520 depicts King Christian I of Denmark attending a banquet in a sala whose walls were hung with 2 silk damasks, both of the same pattern but different colours, used alternately and bound together with ties. These hangings could then be removed easily, which was important during this period. Great households still moved around the countryside to different residences for summer and winter, taking their linens and hangings with them. The king is slightly set apart from the rest of the company, reflecting his status as an exalted host. The Duke of Urbino in the north set a very high standard to follow, and the ideas of his court influenced many. He was one of the most famous generals of his age and a professional condottieri, or mercenary. He became a man of learning, building up an extensive library, and famous as a lavish patron of the arts, with a special interest in astronomy and music. Count Baldassare Castiglione, 1478 to 1529, became ambassador to the papal court at Rome. His letters, many of which still survive, illustrate political and literary history of that time. His book, The Courtier, 1528, became the manual that formed the basis for the ideologies and actions surrounding the behaviour of gentlemen for centuries. It declared a well-rounded man needed attainments in physical, sports and war, intellectual, education, literary and musical accomplishments, as well as moral and social mores. It was a publication found in the libraries of all serious scholars and men of learning for centuries. During the course of the Quattrocento, creators, collectors and connoisseurs steadily became more and more interested in the study of classical antiquity. A special room was set aside to house vast collections in residences and palazzo. The studiolo of rulers and scholars and the objects so meticulously gathered within and displayed were meant to form a model of the world, making it possible for the owner and his companions to better comprehend the nature of the universe. The individual portrait, as opposed to the public and political image, was now important. Portraits were characterized by a calmer expression and composition, and the psychological expressions on the faces of aristocratic sitters were very different from the idealized beauty of a Madonna. Pope Julius II was elected in 1503, and the triumph, or irony if you like, of the influence of a pagan society on a Christian one was that classical statues of pagan gods penetrated the very sanctuary of Christianity itself, the Vatican. The Cortile del Belvedere, or the Pope's courtyard with a fine view, was filled with statues excavated from the remains of Rome. The fame of the Pope's collection spread rapidly throughout the Western world, mentioned in letters and reports of artists, travellers and ambassadors. The exquisite statue of Apollo, the sun god from Greek mythology, had been found in the late 14th century. Known as the Apollo Belvedere, the svelte and elegant pose of the figure, the lightness of its step, the modelling and the smooth softness of its skin were much admired. In 1506, what is considered one of the greatest classical sculptures, the statue of Laocoon and his sons, was found in what appeared to be an underground chamber, which turned out to be part of Nero's famous Golden House. Pope Julius II sent the court architect, Giuliano di Sangelo, to the scene, accompanied by a very young Michelangelo. Well read in classical literature, Sangelo realised immediately what he was looking at. The statue had been mentioned in the Historia Naturalis, 37 volumes of which had been published in the year 77 by Pliny the Elder. He had called it the masterpiece of the arts. As it was discovered at the time Rome was striving towards rebirth, based on its classical past and glorious history, it acquired a special symbolic significance. The Laocoon tells the story of the tragedy of the Trojan priest Laocoon, who warned his people against accepting the Greeks' present of the Trojan horse. In retribution, Athena, the Greek goddess of war, had sent 2 sea serpents to crush him and his sons while they were making sacrifice. Laocoon met his death trying to save his city Troy, but it was defeated, and the next stage would be the foundation of Rome. The second devastating sack of Rome happened in May 1527. It was the climax of 3 decades of violent struggle for the control of Italy by the French and the Spanish. A tragedy far worse than that perpetrated by the Goths 11 centuries earlier began, with looting and senseless destruction by unpaid mercenaries without any ideological, political or religious cause. Over 10,000 people were slaughtered, churches desecrated, convents and their inhabitants violated, houses and palaces ransacked and citizens tortured to reveal their treasures. Charles V, the conquering hero, was hailed in Genoa as the ruler of the world. Ironically, a bronze statue of him depicts him as a warrior of peace, bound in chains to the savage figure of war. As a tribute to the man partially responsible for the sack of Rome, it is not without its irony, and it would be at least 20 years on before Rome would begin to recover its glory. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know.